So that brings us to the Policy and Personnel Committee. You should have received a copy of a policy on student absences and excuses, and I'm going to ask Kayla Goodwine and Talisha Drayton if you'd come forward.
Can I go ahead and get a motion on the floor? Motion to approve first reading of revised policy JH.
Okay, we may not need you.
No, but people probably will have questions.
Okay.
Never know. Maybe not.
Does anybody have any questions? Do y'all want to explain what a level leader is?
Yes. You want me to do that?
Yeah.
Yes.
Anybody?
It's the leaders for the elementary level, leaders for the middle school level,
There they are.
leaders for the high school level.
The people are just up here.
They supervise principals.
Okay. So I just wanted you to make sure that you understood that we're taking it from the associate superintendent to the level leader, and that everybody knew exactly what that was, that person. Okay.
Thank you.
No questions for these ladies?
Great job, great job.
Next item up is the Audit and Finance Committee. First item is Laura Brown funding request. Do you need a motion now? Yes, so do we have a motion to approve those funding requests?
So moved.
All right, we got a motion. Is there a second?
Hang on a second. It's all, we don't have different action items. Y'all lumped it all into the
I'll
information
second it.
item.
Okay, we got a second. Any discussion on it?
I screwed up.
Yeah.
Just in terms of, I guess my question was, how did you decide, based on what they requested and what you approved? I mean, just in general, because I was looking at this Saturday, Sunday, and was just curious as to how you made the decisions to, for instance, approve if they asked for a money amount, and obviously we didn't have the money, and that may have played into it, but how did you?
So we took the total requests from all the schools and the number of people that were attending, and we took the $50,000 and we divided up to a equal per person expense.
And these are the only schools that requested?
Those are the only ones. That's right.
Really? Do all the schools know?
Yes, they do. We send that out multiple times. The challenge is it has to be for a national competition.
Okay.
So you have to, your state and or regional level if that's
Okay.
in the mix to it.
So if we didn't approve it, do the schools have the options of raising the money otherwise so that they could take the projected number of students, for instance, that they wanted to, or will they just have to reduce the number of students that will be attending?
So the guidelines allow for up to 8 students. That's the way the fund is set up. So a school would have to supplement beyond that if they have more than that, or if the cost is above what the per pupil expenditure. And again, because we require a certain number of chaperones and in a gender-specific ratio, we include the chaperone requirement in the per pupil that we're tallying.
Okay.
And none of them were rejected. If they requested the money, then we funded it at the, again, equal level for each of the participants.
Thank you. Sure.
All right, have we voted on that?
Nope.
No, we need to.
We got a motion and a second to approve the Laura Brown fund. Do we not have that?
Well, we have it as an information item, I thought it.
Right, it got
Okay.
put under information.
Okay, so got it. All right, so just for clarification for anybody sitting there, that will go to an action item at the next board meeting for approval on that. With respect to the budget update, Mr. Kennedy.
And may I ask one question?
Yes.
Do we have embedded in our budget for next year a duty-free period for teachers every day in every school?
Not at this time. The principals are doing an analysis to see how close to that we could get. If you noticed in the board brief we sent week before last, we showed you Greenville's budget, and it cost them 73 teaching positions, additional 73 teaching positions in order to provide that. So we believe we have it covered at the middle and high school, at some elementaries, but we have some elementary teachers and some special education teachers who do not have that, but
So you already have it, so every middle and high school teacher has that?
to our knowledge, the level leaders are surveying principals right now to see where we are.
I think it would be very helpful if we got that, if we knew.
We're going to try to get as close to that as we possibly can within the resources allocated.
All right, go ahead, Mr. Kennedy.
Thank you very much. So I'm here to give a budget update in preparation for the second reading of the budget on May 28th. Joining me are, to my right, Jackie Carlin, the Executive Director of Finance, and the Deputy Director. To my left, Lisa Carlin, excuse me, Sizzler. Apologize. And before I get into the presentation itself, the PowerPoint, we did send out to the board Friday responses to questions that you have in a Q&A document. The ones that have not been, the answers that have not been provided yet will be provided prior to the second reading. The agenda is shown on the slide here. We are going to talk about the budget assumptions. There have been some changes. Changes from the first reading to the second reading of the budget. Talk about the changes in the millage and the index of taxpaying ability. I want to talk a little bit about, I heard in a previous conversation here today, I heard a talk about Mitchell Elementary School. I want to talk about how we might be able to support schools like Mitchell. And then also talk about the potential for a fiscal year 20 budget revision later this summer. So there are many assumptions that go into building a budget. These are the significant ones that we have in the fiscal year 20 budget. A 3% increase in assessed property values. That 3% increase is corroborated by the county auditor, so we meet with them on a regular basis to make sure that what we're projecting in terms of changes in assessed property values is what they are actually projecting, and that we're in agreement. So that is a 3% increase in assessed property values. In this second reading of the budget, we're proposing a 3.4 millage increase. Value of a mill is $2.5 million. Later in the presentation, I'll talk about the millage increase that we have. It's going up from a 3.16 in the first reading of the budget to 3.48, and I'll talk about the reasons behind that. The CCSD index of taxpaying ability for Charleston County, that is going up also. That has a financial impact to the district's revenues, state revenues, and we'll talk about, we have a slide on that. And then a 4% salary increase by the state, which is being funded by the state, and then an average 1.9% step increase for teachers. The 4%, I'm sorry, relates to teachers, certificated staff, and then 1.9% would be amounts that will be funded by the district. And then a base student cost decrease of $18 from $24.85 to $24.67. So this year, fiscal year 19, the base student cost for every student in the state of South Carolina is at $24.85. And in the House Ways and Means budget, that goes down by $18 in the Senate version. The Senate restores that, but that has not been reconciled yet, and so we don't have that. Therefore, we have the $24.67 in this budget assumption. So the reconciliation, the first reading that was done last month to proposed second reading, which is later this month. At the very top here, we show the projected revenues of $536 million from the first reading. We are adjusting that by $863,000, which are comprised of those two figures here. The remaining millage increase from 3.16 mil, which was in the first reading of the budget, to 3.48 in the second reading. So the 3.48 is the allowable millage for Charleston School District that was given to us by the state. So the state, every year, they give all districts in the state their allowable millage increase under Act 388. Typically, when we do our first reading of the budget, we have received from the state what those numbers are, what the allowable millage increase will be. This year, the state timeline was different, and so when we presented the first reading of the budget, we did not have the numbers from the state, and so we estimated, based on an average of the last 3 years, and that was 3.16 millage increase. And so this proposed increase from 3.16 for additional 0.32 up to 3.48 does not represent a budget additional request to the board. It simply recognizes what the state is allowing the district to raise millage by. And we have a slide in here to talk a little bit more about the millage and how it's calculated, so I'll get into that a little bit later. And then also the charter school administrative fee. In the first reading of the budget, we had proposed, since we have a significant number of charter schools in the district, and there's a lot of administrative support by the district to be able to support those in various fashions. And so the state law allows for a district to charge charter schools a fee to be able to fund a position, or fund a partial position in some cases, to be able to provide administrative support services that we provide. And so that percentage fee is 0.25, which would be applied if it's adopted by the board to the revenues that we allocate to the charter schools, and that would generate this $118,000 that would go to fund a position exclusive for charter school administration. So those are the additional, those two factors there are the additional increases in revenue in the second reading, the proposed second reading. And then at the bottom here, we adjust the expenditures by the exact amount of the increased revenues, the $745,000, to create what's being called the sustainability fund for former priority schools. And I have a section in the presentation where I'll get into that in more detail. And then the $118,000 to fund the charter school coordinator position that we talked about on the top part of the slide. And
May I ask a question?
Yes.
Is that charter school coordinator position, is that the salary, or is that the salary with your benefits and the district's portion of employer contribution included?
So that includes the 100% of the cost. So the salary and the benefits.
And we've had someone managing charter schools before we created this position. I mean, we would have that person come and talk to us when it was time to talk about charter schools. So now we have two people doing that job?
No, so the person I think that you're referring to has multiple duties within the district. Charter schools just being a small fraction of that. And so we spend a lot of time on charter schools, not just that one person, but other people in the district also. So that person would no longer, be a transitional period, but that person would no longer be the charter school person.
But the source for those funds is coming out of what we would otherwise pay a charter.
That is correct.
Yes.
Yes, because the admin fee comes back to us.
Yes.
That's
But
correct.
that source is,
That is right, yeah.
it is this year. I don't know that that our admin fees are going to grow with your contribution. Have you anticipated the increase in salary that'll come from this person after year one?
Well, we have not, but
I'm worried for how long it's going to match.
yeah, I understand, but if you take a look at the historical increase in the charter school revenues that we allocate, those grow, and those have grown. And so the charter school funding formula is a factor of the student demographics as well as the district's revenue. So as our revenue increase, then the proportional share increases also over to the charter school. So I would anticipate, Ms. Coates, that it would maintain.
Okay.
And if I could follow up.
Go ahead.
Before you, because I didn't hear the answer to if the entire amount that's allocated here is for salary and
the insurance
fringes
match.
for the position.
It is, yes, ma'am.
So the 745,000 sustainability of funds for former priority schools, were you not going to spend this money in those schools next year? And now you are?
So
In first reading, this money didn't exist, so what, are you adding to former priority schools? Because I see where you're getting the state and federal for the current ones.
yeah.
How was this being funded before?
So it was not. And so I'm going to talk about that later in the presentation. I have several slides on that because it was not funded before. That is the issue here. It was not funded before. So then that takes oh, and by the way, at the end of the presentation that was distributed, there's the budget summary from the first reading of the budget. It's not part of the PowerPoint, but it's the budget summary from the first reading, which is included in the budget book, so you can see some of the details there. So next, I want to talk about the allowable millage. Indicated that the allowable millage for fiscal year 20, which is shown in this slide on the right column, is 3.48. It shows the history going back to fiscal year 18, 3.11, 3.36, and the 3.48. In the allowable millage under Act 388, it's comprised of two components: the costs, CPI, Consumer Price Index, and the population change in the state. And so what the Act recognizes under the allowable millage, that from an economic standpoint, there are increased costs associated with these two factors. As the CPI goes up, then the costs for goods and services, in this case services, increase. And as the population increases, there's a need for additional resources. And so you can see for fiscal year 20, the CPI is increasing by 2.44%, and the population in the state is increasing by the 1.04%. So under the Act 388, then, it recognizes that those economic conditions change. It's changed by 3.48%, and so school district, Charleston County rather, is allowed to increase its millage by 3.48%. Now, again, this is not the district, the staff trying to increase the revenue, the taxes here. Simply what we did before in the first reading was an estimate, and this just reconciles the estimate to what the actual allowable amount is for the district.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. So one of the challenges that the district has under Act 388, if we were not to use the available millage that's been authorized by the state, and then we talk to state legislators about the need for tax reform to be able to allow us to tap into the resources that we have, then it becomes problematic. And I have a slide to talk about the index of tax payability, which will explain that a little bit better here in a second. But I will say that in the Post and Courier this morning, there was an article on Dorchester 2 School District, and where they're talking about they're $8 million short in their budget right now as they develop their budget. And the reason that they gave is because of Act 388, and they have not been able to tap into the property values under Act 388, and we suffer from the same challenge here in Charleston.
One thing I noted in that article that is an issue we haven't addressed was, just a quick comment, they've got half the number of students, but a quarter of the number of schools that we do.
Good point.
So essentially, we've got twice as many schools for every student than they do.
Like we do in, like Greenville.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And then this slide here, if the board were to adopt a 3.48 mil increase, this just gives an example of a impact to a taxpayer. And so what we used arbitrarily a assessed property value, in this case a vehicle of $15,000 with assessed property value. Assessment rate on vehicles is 6%, and so the assessed value of that then is $900. And then the increased millage, the millage of 3.48, the increased millage of 3.48 would result in an increase in taxes to this taxpayer of $3.13. And so instead of next year paying $110.85 on the vehicle, the taxes would be the $113.98, so an increase of $3.13. This slide here, ITA stands for Index of Tax Payability. So, as you know, there are multiple components of the state's education funding formulas. We talked a minute ago about Act 388, and a second component is the Index of Tax Payability. And what the Index of Tax Payability takes all of the 46 counties in the state of South Carolina, and it takes all of the assessed property values. And each county gets their percentage, what is their percentage to the whole. And so when that calculation is done, Charleston County is the wealthiest county in the state of South Carolina in terms of property values, and we've been that way for a long time. So for fiscal year 19, the right-hand column there, our index of taxpayer ability is the 0.13595. But fiscal year 20 has gone up. So that means that the fact that it's gone up, we have gotten even more wealthier, and so this part of the funding formula says that a district that has tremendous wealth, or a county that has tremendous wealth, should bear a greater portion of educating their students relative to the state and relative to other counties. So a county that's poor, let's say like Collington, which we looked at, they would not get as much, they would expect to get more support, financial support from the state percentage-wise than what we would. And so in this particular funding formula here, portion of it, for this year, for the fiscal year 19, under this portion of the EFA, the Education Finance Act, for every dollar that we send up to the state, they send us 34 cents back. That's the second line there. We're sending state support. Next year, that goes down to 31 cents because of our wealth increase. Now, so the concept makes, at least to me, it makes sense. But where the challenge is that we have the ability, in terms of the wealth of this county, to be able to provide a greater share of support on education. But the countervailing part of the formula says that under Act 388, you cannot tap into that, those resources. And so in the article that we talked about this morning in the Post and Courier in Dorchester 2, they talked about over the time since Act 388 has been in place that they've lost $84 million, I think it was, that they otherwise could have tapped into. And the article referenced the Charleston County auditor saying that it says just for this fiscal year, now we haven't talked to them about this, that Charleston County would lose $151 million in terms of being able to access that. And what we had calculated earlier this year in one of the presentations that we made was that for I think the current fiscal year that we had estimated that we could have brought in an additional $61 million in local tax revenue. Not saying that the board would go that high, but we had the capacity to do that. But because of the Act 388, we aren't allowed to even propose it, much less trying to get there. So next I want to talk about the sustainability fund concept, the $745,000. So this slide here that says variations in elementary schools, I've shown this a number of times. I've shown the schools in green, which are the high-performing, select high-performing elementary schools. I've shown the ones in yellow, which are select average performing schools, and the ones at the bottom here, select low-performing schools. What I have not shown before is the one in blue here, which is representative of was Mitchell Elementary School, which I'm using as a representative of schools that are former state-identified priority schools. And so Mitchell at one point was lower performing. They probably would have been down in the red box. And you can see now that they're in this blue box because their metrics are a lot better than what they had been previously. So you take a look at teacher experience, 14.45 years average teacher experience for Mitchell. That compares very favorably. It actually is greater than the high-performing rated schools. The principal at the school has been there for 8 years, where in the red schools, the average time tenure at that school, those schools, 1.5 years. The turnover for teacher turnover in Mitchell is 10%, which is the same as the high-performing schools versus 24% in the unsatisfactory schools. The South Carolina Red scores are elevated relative to the lower performing schools, and the high school suspension is like only 22 versus 100 more under the low performing schools. And so what happens then is that the school is receiving some state additional resources because they're low performing. There's an effort to turn the school, turn the performance of the school around. That effort has, in this case, been successful. And then once the school is no longer identified as a priority school in need, then those additional resources are taken away, and the demographics of the student body, the demographics have not changed. So some of the challenges that the school was working under when they had the state funds have now, those challenges still exist, and the resources aren't there. And so I've talked with the principal there, I've talked with a couple other principals in those types of conditions, and I want to try to figure out through this budget process, is there a way to support them. And so the next two slides, it just simply shows some of the schools that are state-identified CSI, state-identified priority schools that were identified last fall. And you can see the additional dollars, the supports that they get. So you see in with the column where it says CSI Federal Spring, CSI Federal Fall, CSI State Spring, CSI State Fall. These are additional dollars from the state and the federal government that these schools would get because they are priorities. A school like Mitchell that used to be a priority school and used to get these types of funds, when that school no longer receives these funds, but the needs are still there. And this slide here talks about some of the needs. For some reason, I failed to put the poverty rate in here. I believe it's like 84% or so. So the high poverty, academic achievements, we talked about it a second ago, and how they're making progress, have made progress. They have lost staffing allocations from current fiscal year 19 to fiscal year 20. And they have huge needs at the school in terms of mental health counseling. Some of the staff positions that are lost is in that area. Other drawbacks, you can see there that the student-teacher ratio in the 5th grade is considered by the principal to be pretty high. The high percentage of 5th grade students with individual education plans, and a high percentage of students with significant challenges outside of school. And so the action here is then how to determine how to financially support schools that lose resources due to academic gain. So you make progress and you get essentially penalized for doing so, penalized in terms of the allocations that we send out. And so what's being proposed in the, what will be proposed in the fiscal year, in the second reading of the fiscal year 20 budget, is that we use the additional this year, the 0.32 millage that we did not plan for in the first reading, to create, and it hasn't been created yet, but to create something along the line of sustainability funds so that we can provide the supports to schools like Mitchell.
So how many schools lost mental health counseling and student ratio funds between the budget they're doing this year and the budget for next year?
So I don't have that information today, but we're working on it. And so my assumption is that individual schools lost supports in different areas. So this is one school, and so we will take a look at the other, what other schools exist in the district that were former priority schools that may have lost. So I've had conversation with the principal at Mitchell, I've had conversation with the principal at Memminger, but I just haven't done the full analysis yet.
So we have the per school budget from first reading. What are the priority schools? What are the former priority schools? We can look for ourselves to see what their budget decreases are. Do we know what schools they are?
So I don't know those today, Ms. Coates. We will have those very shortly. I mean, I simply haven't done that analysis yet, but I will.
So I know 4 of them, but I would just prefer not to rattle off without checking, for fear we'd miss someone.
So it would be a relatively easy thing to see that their budget for next year goes down than from the one that we're currently working on.
Or if the budget doesn't go down, because it's not necessarily a budget going down, with teacher pay raises, you have to watch both things. They can still lose positions. And one thing we haven't mentioned today that Mr. Kennedy probably is going to mention is our worry about, we've mentioned it before, the salary positions that are in federal funds. And the fact that the growth in those funds is not even beginning to keep pace with what we have to pay in salaries and benefits here.
Yeah, for instance, one of the analysis that's being done in collaboration with the Learning Services is that on the IDA federal funding is not increasing, but the population numbers in terms of our students with special needs is increasing, along with the salary increases. And then the last section here is to talk about the $5 million reserve that's being proposed to address these things here, as well as any recommendations that will come from the staff that have not been made yet. And so, as you know, in the first reading of the budget, you adopted a $5 million contingency for the mission critical actions, et cetera, because those suggestions and board adoption won't take place until at the earliest June 24th. And right now, the budget is supposed to be approved May 28th, and so that'll be subsequent to that time period. And so here's the concern, is that we have $5 million that if adopted, would be in the budget in the budget book, without actually being incorporated into the budget itself, into the system with specifics. And it presents a number of challenges, and at least 2 or 3 pretty critical challenges. One is, sometimes things get dynamic in terms of the direction we're headed in. And the one way to guard against significant changes once decisions have been made is to get it actually captured in the budget, and then in order to change direction, then you have to change that budget. And then the second piece there is, if it's outside of the budget, it's a technical challenge of trying to keep track of where we are. And so what's being proposed here is that, assuming that the budget is adopted at the end of this month, the end of May, is that the staff comes back to the board in August for a fiscal year 20 budget revision. So that will give the board time to weigh in, make their directions known on any changes for the use of the $5 million. That will give staff time to work through the year-end close, and to incorporate the changes on the mission critical actions and other actions, and get those incorporated into the budget deliberations, and then bring back to the board in August a budget revisions that reflect those changes. And with that, that concludes the presentation. So other than to say this is the event document that shows at the bottom there that the second reading of the budget is scheduled for May 28th.
All right, what questions does anybody have? Can start with Reverend Mack, then Ms. Green.
Okay, so I had 2 quick questions. So I think, and I was in on the audit and finance call or meeting, and so I think what you're saying about the having us review in August is we're going and do a budget revision is so that we can, with the June mission critical recommendations that are going to come to us and whatever staff's going to recommend, we could potentially put in some new and different things or some changes that we want to do that will really impact student achievement, and that's what we'll do in that budget revision. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
Okay.
Can I ask my second question
Yep,
real
go
quick?
ahead.
Sorry. The other thing I have, and this is coming kind of from a bit my business side, and I know we did a grant that looked at kind of, I hate to say it this way, compensation for performance, but are districts out there at all looking at, I mean, we have some school leaders and teachers who are doing some really great things, and like the learning services staff who were up here today and talking about all those things. We have people that are doing that already. Is there any way we can incentivize, and that might be a question for Cindy, but is that an area, or the superintendent might be saying, shut up, Kate, is that something that we want to do or have? I mean, this is a problem we've been talking about, this district's been talking about for the entire, 50 years it's been in existence. So is that something that schools or districts are doing effectively, where we you're doing it really well, so we're going to incentivize you to continue to do that, or for you to help other principals and teachers do that?
So, I do know that several years ago, the federal government had the Teacher Incentive Fund,
Yep.
which allowed some districts that were awarded the grant to, across the country, to approach that type of incentive. And so one of the things that we could do, certainly I haven't done, perhaps the superintendent and Ms. Ambrose have this already, but we could take a look where in the country some school districts were successful with that grant and use that grant to continue that process. And I know I've heard the superintendent talk about some year-end type incentives that we might want to consider.
That's true, that's a good point.
Reverend Mack?
Don, I want to go back to the 9th slide.
Which one?
And,
Ninth.
The 9th slide, I'm sorry. So, and this may be a Cindy question or answer to the question, but, so, the amount of money that's allocated over the course of, for the period of time for the various schools. So this is additional funding that will be on top of what will be allocated to each school, and they will be able to use this funding for what type of services, or is that left at the school level?
I think it's a combination of some of the funds will be used at the school level, so principals, they have to develop and have developed plans. In some cases, those plans have to go to the state, but those plans are developed by principals in collaboration with the level leaders and others in the central office. And so part of these funds then would be allocated school by school and used school by school. We did have, we being district leaders, including superintendent, had a conversation a few weeks ago with Dr. LaToya Dixon out of the South Carolina Department of Education. Some of these funds can be be used collectively to support infrastructure, and when I say infrastructure, I'm not talking about buildings, but strategies that can be rolled out across multiple schools versus just going to one school. So that work is being developed now.
So help me to understand this then. So are you saying then that the plan that's already in place for, yes, let's use North Charleston High School for an example. So the efforts that's being put into place to help strengthen those schools and core content areas or resources that are needed in those particular schools. So are we building on top of what we're putting in place to strengthen it, to make it more viable moving forward, or are we using portion of these fundings at that school and then spreading it elsewhere throughout the district?
Well, so with North Charleston High School, as an example, where it says CSI State Spring Funds, $115,000. So it's a column that says CSI State Spring. So that $115,000, the principal at that school, his staff, in conjunction with the central office, they have decided in their plans how that $115,000 would be used, specific to that school. Coming to the left here, where it says CSI federal dollars, fall of fiscal year 20, $140,000. Plans have not been made for that $140,000. So all of those dollars in fall, CSI federal fall FY20 at $101.1 million, that column currently is under consideration how we might be able to use those funds collectively versus just individual schools.
So may I ask a follow-up
Okay.
question?
No, Ms. Green's next.
If it's follow-up, she can go.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah.
So if I heard you correctly, the district is going to receive $1,120,000 in the fall of 2020, in the fall of 19 for the school year 19-20. Next fall, September.
For next fall, this coming fall, October specifically,
This money will flow in October.
in October, but it's not coming to the district, it's going to these individual schools, but we have the opportunity to collaborate with the schools and to collectively figure out how to support, develop some initiatives, some efforts that collectively supports these schools.
Will y'all be able to speak to that before we approve the budget? I mean, just using the charter school coordinator position, this money doesn't buy you 2 people. So unless we're doing it for something else. So I mean, will we have some idea of what that money is going to buy?
So we already have plans for the CSI State Spring, for sure. So that's been solidified. The CSI Federal the fall dollars that are coming in. Those plans have not been developed, and they are being developed now. I don't have a timeline today on that, but we will make note of that. And so you're asking, will those plans be developed by the time that you adopt the budget at the end of this month?
Okay, Ms. Green?
I wanted to ask, maybe this is for Dr. Closaway, about we were talking about the breaks and that the teacher breaks, and that the principals were now, you had them assessing what the needs would be. When will we have that information, and will we have it if we want to make a decision about including that cost in this budget?
Right. You will know that by May 28th. Then there are we're talking about 2 different things. We're talking about a planning period for every teacher every day.
Right.
And do they have time to eat lunch without having to supervise children? And so it's possible in most schools to work a master schedule to arrange for coverage of the lunch without extra cost. The difficulty is giving every teacher a planning period. If you have 5 teachers teaching in one grade level, it takes 1 other teacher to take each of those classes for 45 minutes. That requires a whole other teacher, and then maybe you're looking at adding something in the arts or humanities. So it is somewhat complicated, and we should have that information after the May principals meeting, which falls before the May 28th budget meeting. That's another reason we're suggesting that you adopt the budget now, but let us work with the schools to develop those kinds of approaches. We would love to be able to give every teacher a planning period and, if possible, a duty-free lunch for the coming year. But we don't have the luxury of adding dozens of teachers to do that at this point. So you'll know that by May 28th. I'm not sure exactly when we will know that.
All right. What other questions?
So
I'd like to follow up, just
All right.
a clarification of that CSI funds. Mr. Kennedy's doing a great job of staying in his lane as the CFO, but it is complex, and what I think we just need to very frankly say is that in the past, for the most part, the school improvement funds have gone to the schools, and in some cases they've been used very wisely. And in other cases, looking back, they've been used in ways that were the best anyone knew to do, but there was no evidence that investing in that particular approach, strategy, counselor, consultant, resulted in significant growth for students. So we're trying, by law, those funds go to the schools, but we're trying to work with schools. An example of a collective action would be if a school has a lot of children who are low performing in reading, and we find that there's a particular reading approach or curriculum that works to accelerate the growth of those students, the principals across those schools could agree to provide that kind of training, and then we would be permitted to invite teachers from other schools that have low-performing students to participate in that training, if doing so wouldn't dilute the experience for the teachers in those schools. So we're trying to figure out what the rules are, because they're changing. The State Department is willing to let us submit something, and right now we've figured out it's smaller than a bread box, but we don't exactly know what will be permitted. So Mr. Kennedy's trying to avoid, I think, giving you any information that turns out not to be accurate. But we want principals to have as much autonomy as possible, but they've had a lot of autonomy. And our biggest challenge right now is implementation fidelity.
Hey, go ahead.
Are your comments pertaining to the state, the state and federal, or just state?
Both state and federal.
Well, but the principals still are accountable. I mean, so even though the funds come to them, I mean, the use of those funds, I mean, could also play into the accountability factor in them doing their jobs effectively.
That's a very rational point of view.
Rational doesn't always make.
It should, you're
Yeah.
absolutely right, it
Right,
should.
right,
And,
right, right.
and the advantage of the board adopting these 10 steps again and helping make them clear over and over and over and over is that our biggest challenge is implementation fidelity. So we can't say enough times, this is what we're doing, and these are the kinds of results we expect. And what we haven't done, and you didn't hear it in the presentation today because we haven't done it, is get clear about how much growth is acceptable. What will we accept as a reasonable amount of growth for children in every single setting? Because if it can be done in one setting, we need to figure out how to get it done in every setting and why it's not getting done in every setting. And that's the come to the altar discussion we simply must have in a more frontal effort than we've managed thus far.
Okay, I'll meet you at the altar then.
Yeah, because as far as looking at what's acceptable, like just at looking at our third grade ELA results, and I know tests aren't everything, but to figure out where, like particularly looking at our African American students, you have to get down to 30% to even include the majority of our
Minority.
schools by 30% of African American kids reading on grade level in third grade. Well, you got to go way down before you got a cut score, or less. Otherwise, they're all
Right.
unacceptable,
Right.
and nearly all.
And because all of that is calculated on a bell curve of
Right.
a normal distribution, we need to look at things like Lexiles. And we also need to follow a student longitudinally, not this year's third grade
Versus
versus.
or this year's test versus whatever
Right.
we hired, whatever we employ next year.
So there are just so many different issues with that, but you're absolutely right. We need to get clear about what metrics we'll accept and how we look at not this year's fourth graders compared to next year's fourth graders, but what happened to this year's fourth graders, where were they, and now what Lexile level are they at in fifth grade? So we can start following that growth with a particular group of students, which the state analyses don't do for us. So we have to start looking at the longitudinal growth on something like Lexile bands of readiness for every grade level and looking at how well our students are doing. If we can make that turn with not only the individual student growth bands, but regionally with every district, and then what readiness looks like feeding children into job opportunities or further education, then we can begin to make sense of what's happening. But that's what has to happen. And we've got to get very disciplined and determined and absolutely not stray from that in our meetings. Meeting after meeting after meeting, that's what we need to be looking at.
Well, I think it's clear, that's why we indicated those board directives in the early on the onset, because these are critical areas that needs to be addressed. I mean, Todd has said it enough. We clearly know that we're struggling with how do we improve Afro-American kids, and how do we close that gap, and how do we make things better? And I think, we have to really dive into it and carve it out and really look deeply into our Afro-American students and what type of needed resources have to happen at that school. Again, we've been kicking this can down the road for some time, talking about closing the achievement gap and closing the gap between Afro-American kids and white kids, and how do we talk about it, and sometimes you just can't lump it all together. You really have to carve it out and say, okay, these set of kids in a particular area are needing additional resources. How do we make that happen? I think in this mission critical piece, we have to be bold and we have to be aggressive and say, look, we're going to have to carve this out and we're going to have to add these resources here where they're needed and make it happen. I mean, it is where we are. And this has been going on for some time. And so the question is, what are we going to do about it?
Well, and I think that's the part. I appreciate the directives, but we know exactly what the Lexiles need to be. And so I don't know why we need to have a directive that says we need to talk about Lexiles. This board was given this 6 weeks ago.
Well, I'll tell you why we need a directive.
Right, so, no, I understand what you're saying, but I would rather 4 of those 10 things we need to say is done. And we need to start talking today that, if we're going to choose Lexiles. So I'm not saying that I just want to be clear that my
Which we
vote.
have already.
Right.
Yep.
My vote against the 10 things isn't that they're not good 10 things, it's that we've done 6 of them, and I don't know why we're not talking about those 6 things with actual nouns and goals today. I don't know why we're going to get something back in 30 days that we got in April of 2019. So I really just, I think you've got a board that is more supportive and ready to make changes. And we've done a lot of yeses in the last 5 months, and we're looking to see those things that you told us to say yes to in the budget. And so that's where we're just, and I think if this is your time, like Eric said, this has come to the altar, but we knew in December of 2018 what Rich Gordon needed to start doing for K through 5 for career awareness. So that's what we expect to see in the first reading of the budget, because we've known for 5 months. I'm looking at what he told us has to happen in K5. I don't want to see, we need to talk about what to do with CAS, because we already did and we agreed with what y'all proposed. So, would it be beneficial to you guys? You guys created the May 28th deadline. That's not a state deadline. That's not a fiscal year deadline. Would it be beneficial if we gave y'all 2 more weeks?
No, I don't think so. We need to wait for the community committees to come back with recommendations.
They're going to come back a month after May 28th.
They are, which is
Okay.
why we're recommending that you approve a preliminary budget, because
Okay.
it takes a lot of time to get the budget loaded and ready to go for July 1. But then I have another opportunity to make some major revisions in August. This simply tells you that in addition to the community recommendations that are coming in on May 24th, you'll have a set of very clear recommendations from the leadership team that may not have bubbled up from the community work.
What other questions? Go ahead.
I just have a statement, comment to make. And I hear exactly what everybody's been saying, and I don't want anybody to interpret this the wrong way, and this might not be what anybody is saying, but I think when you look at what we're spending per pupil, there are lots of places that we're spending a really high per pupil expenditure, and we have really, really low achievement. And we have other places that we're spending less per pupil achievement with basically a very similar demographics, and those students are doing better. And we just can't, we have to be really targeted, and I think that's what you're telling us you want us to do. But we can't just throw money at, and not have discussion about what we're doing differently, because
We had
just
that
putting-
discussion this time last year.
yeah, just putting money out there doesn't solve the issue.
I think, and we're behind y'all, but we raised taxes 3.5 mils last year, and we want to know what that got us. And if it got us no improvement in education whatsoever, we need to acknowledge that and say what we're going to do different next year. But we're doing the same changes year over year, and then saying we're going to make the same changes next year.
What final questions do anybody have on? Go ahead, Ms. Green.
Just to follow up with what Cindy's just said about the results of what we did last year. I mean, will we get a report on that, or is there nothing to report, or?
So the state tests are occurring for the most part this week. We can give you map test results fairly quickly. The extent to which those will translate into state tests, I don't know, but we can show you fairly quickly the growth or lack thereof we think we're seeing at every school, particularly in terms of Lexile levels and across those grade level bands.
That would be, that's
Yep.
great. That would be exactly what you.
So, I guess I just want to be clear that when I talk about closing the achievement gap and adding resources to where they need to be, I guess I just need to be clear is that we can't compare small numbers to large numbers when we look at per pupil dollars. Because if the
Light
enrollment
bills.
is small, then you're going to have more per pupil dollars per student. If the enrollment is high, you'll have less. But I do feel very strongly that we have to add resources where they're needed. Now, if we're not getting the results that's needed at the end of the day in the schools to where we have these low performance, then we have to seriously, aggressively look at, is the leadership the right person in the school? Or if the teachers that are in the classrooms are producing the results that's needed. Now, if we're talking about closing the gap and we're talking about adding the resources where they need to be, then we have to be aggressive across the board, because every day and every month and every year that goes by and we're not getting those gains, then we will be right where we are talking about the same thing 5 years down the road. So at the end of the day, Don, as you begin to look at these numbers and you're beginning to create the budget and looking at resources and leaders are projecting numbers moving forward, all I'm saying is that we have the data, we have the report, we have the conclusion, and we can see where the resources are needed and where we need to add more funding to make it better or to improve or to bring about the change at the end of the day. All I'm saying is that we just need to make sure that we add the resources where they need to be.
Well, and every other industry does this. I can't figure out why we've talked about this year after year after year, why we can't get a above controllable line and a below controllable line. We know the light bill at Wando is not controllable. It's not dependent on the number of students, and while it may be a part of the student cost, we can't control the light bill at Burns. I mean, the SC&G doesn't cut us a
And
break.
those aren't included in
They are included in the.
our per pupil spending.
They're not?
No,
So these
those
numbers
salaries.
these numbers.
We spend a total of $18,000 per student if you look at our total cost.
So we might need to make sure we put something in there because people don't know you're separating that out.
Todd is.
Yep.
He'll shut it down.
Go ahead.
I have not said anything all day. And I think there's one piece that we've left out of this discussion, at least from the board, and you can't really put dollars to it, but there's one piece that I never hear us talking about, and that is curriculum. And I know that the educators here already know that, but I think that the board members need to remember it's not just how many bodies are sitting in seats and whether there's a good principal. What are we teaching in those classrooms that's exciting kids and engaging kids? And I know you all are working on it, and maybe at some point we can talk about that a little more, because that's as important as some of the other things that you've been talking about.
Just one final comment. I want to make sure that all of us are of the same mindset. When we say resources, we are talking about first and foremost talent and time, and then money.
Yep.
Money buys talent and extends time, but it simply isn't money.
Absolutely.
Only money.
Yeah. And it's school culture, and I'm going to wrap that around with curriculum, too. You can tell when you walk in a school if kids are excited about learning and they're engaged. And I just want that to be also part of our discussions.
All right. The next item up is public comments. We have anyone else want to make public comment? Nope, okay, all right. The next item up we have is, our next meeting is May 13th. Correction, upcoming meeting is May 28th.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Don.
Sorry.
Is there a motion to adjourn?
Move to
Just want to
adjourn.
remind everyone about the June 10th committee, the whole meeting. Please make note that we will be in in operation that full day, beginning at 9 a.m. Also, please make sure that you let Julie know by the end of this week, the graduation's attendance that needs to happen. Please make sure you do that as soon as possible. And then also, I just lost our last train of thought. Please make note in the Friday update, Dr. Postwaite included volunteer day for Board of Trustees to please see.
Volunteer what?
Volunteer a day at a school before
yeah,
the closure of school, the day of your choice, if you would let Ms. Taylor, Erica Taylor know of your school of choice. And it could be, 2, 3, 4, 5 hours, but I think we need to grasp some changes we're about to make or hoping to be discussing here by June 24th. Board members need to at least participate in volunteering at a school to kind of get a feel of what we're talking about. So I just want to make note of that.
And I do need to tell you that there's a county-wide event at College of Charleston on June 10th from 8:30 to 12, so some people may not be able to be here for that whole day.
All right, we got a motion to adjourn. Is there a second?
Second.
All in
Countywide,
favor, aye? All right, go ahead.
countywide, what kind of event?
This was my, sorry,
County,
I
who
didn't have
county?
enough time to talk. But when I was saying privatization.
Us?
There's so many different.